All right, hello, History 363. So today we're going to talk about the first part, at least, of the Second Punic War. So when we left off, the Romans have defeated a major Gallic invasion, particularly the Battle of Telamon, they, after repelling the Celts, continue to push into Cisalpine Gaul, putting two colonies at Cremona and Placentia. So this is one of the things they're doing while this whole crisis with Saguntum was unfolding. They also fight a war with the Illyrians in 219 while this whole crisis with the Saguntum is unfolding. But in 218, the war breaks out, and both sides again are moving against each other. The Romans plan to send consular armies to both Spain and Africa to strike the Carthaginians quickly and decisively. And meanwhile, Hannibal strikes first. He starts moving with a large army. It's probably about 56,000 men by the time it crosses the Pyrenees and pushes across southern France, crosses the Rhone. Too late, the Romans realize that a major land-based invasion of Italy is taking place, and so they redirect their forces. They cancel the invasion of Africa, and only a smaller force is sent to Spain, where it will operate on the Ebro River, but both of the consuls are going to remain to defend Italy. Now, Hannibal's crossing of Italy, which takes place in the winter, is notoriously difficult. Hannibal loses probably nearly half of his force, but he comes out on the other side, his men frostbitten, most of his elephants dead, into Cisalpine Gaul, a place that is swarming with Gauls who are furious at Rome, terrified of Rome, and ready to accept any ally who will help them try to rectify the situation. Hannibal seems to be aware of what's going on in Cisalpine Gaul and knows that if he can get his army there, he will find many Gallic warriors who would be willing to join his cause. So Hannibal, his army, which according to Publius, he only has about 26,000 men by the time he gets to the other side of the Alps. But that army then swells with Gallic recruits and confronts the joint army of the two consuls, Publius Cornelius Scipio and Sempronius Gracchus. Now, prior to the big confrontation, there had been a small cavalry battle, actually I take it back, a large cavalry battle, but a strictly kind of large cavalry skirmish between Hannibal and the Romans commanded by Scipio. And in that skirmish, the consul Scipio had actually been wounded and had supposedly been rescued by his son, who's also named, and here's where Roman names are so frustrating, is also named Publius Cornelius Scipio. The son, watch for him. He's going to be one of Rome's most important generals during the war. He'll be the one who ultimately defeats the Carthaginians in 202 BC. But right now he's just a young teenage cavalryman, but he sort of drags his father to safety and is kind of recognized as a hero for this feat. So this cavalry skirmish is the Battle of the Ticinus River, which is just a tributary of the Po. Subsequently, the two consular armies link up. Scipio is wounded, and so the main command is going to be Sempronius Gracchus. And here Hannibal achieves one of the first great traps, one of the first kind of tactical masterpieces that succeeds in destroying the opposing Roman force. The armies confront each other. Initially, there was sort of wide-ranging skirmishing, but Hannibal's main army is drawn up on the far side of the Trebia River. The Trebia River is likewise a tributary of the Po. And Hannibal seems to be aware that Roman commanders, or he's banking that Roman commanders are extremely aggressive and will gladly hurl themselves headlong into the trap that he has set up. Namely, he's got his forces on the opposite side of the river, but he's detached some and hidden them so that they can envelop the Romans once they blunder across. And so the consul Sempronius Gracchus, as this skirmishing takes place, and the Romans are actually having some success in the skirmish. Remember, a big chunk of the Roman army are these Velites, these skirmishers. decided he's going to push his heavy infantry forces across the river. Now remember, it's still early in the year, so the river is extremely cold, and this means that the Roman army comes across the river, and now the soldiers are soaked to the bone, they're shivering, they're sort of physically degraded, and they may also be somewhat disorganized. I mean, river crossings are extremely difficult even for the most well-disciplined army. And remember, this is the citizen militia. This is the levy for 218. So the Roman soldiers aren't themselves particularly experienced at this point. In fact, Hannibal's army is quite likely much, much more experienced from all the fighting that's been going on in Spain. So the dripping, freezing Roman soldiers now move to confront Hannibal's army. They meet with Hannibal's main force, and at this point, Hannibal springs the trap that the forces that he's hidden in kind of rough terrain and vegetation emerge. The Roman army is enveloped, and a good deal of it is destroyed, although some of them manage to break through Hannibal's center and retreat to Cremona and Placentia. So this is the first battle, the Battle of Trebia in 218 BC, where Hannibal manages to destroy, or at least a big chunk of two Roman consular armies and inflict very heavy casualties upon both the Romans and their allies. Now the next year, the Romans, Hannibal now is able to operate in Cisalpine Gaul, and the next year he moves into Etruria, so now he's definitely stepping into Roman Italy. The Romans dispatch a consular army commanded by Gaius Flaminius. Gaius Flaminius had been that tribune of the plebs who had sponsored the bill to provide homesteads to Roman citizens up in Cisalpine Gaul, in the Ager Gallicus, and now he's reached the consulship. But Hannibal is actually threatening what clearly has been his big project. He's previously also been a commander. He's been consul once before, and he's been a commander in the Gallic War, where he had been successful in repelling a Gallic force. Gaius Flaminius, as consul, is moving through Etruria, and near Lake Trasimene, Hannibal manages what is actually a very difficult feat. He lays an ambush, and it's a very rare instance of one army ambushing another army. Again, obviously ambushes are a pretty common feature in warfare, but usually they're done between pretty small units, a squad ambushing a squad, or a company ambushing a platoon, or it's very rare for an entire army to ambush another army, simply because it's very hard to pull off hiding all those soldiers so that you can spring surprise. But Hannibal takes advantage of the rough terrain and the vegetation along the lake. Flaminius and his army, as they move along this lake, are kind of moving on the low ground by the shoreline, and they're probably practicing pretty shoddy marching discipline, maybe because they're not expecting to be attacked. Remember, this is a citizen army that's been raised in that levy before. Again, less experienced than Hannibal's veteran troops. And so as they move along, they move into the kind of kill zone that Hannibal has. Hannibal springs his trap, his soldiers rush from their positions, and Flaminius is killed, and the army is basically annihilated. So now Hannibal has destroyed another Roman consular army at the Battle of Trasimene in 217 BC. Flaminius himself, who seems to be hated by the Gauls, supposedly a Gallic warrior, cuts off his head, then cuts off the crown of his head, inverts it, and uses it to make a drinking cup out of his skull. That's how much the Celts, the Gallic peoples of Cisalpine Gaul, hate Gaius Flaminius. So now Rome is in full-on emergency mode, and they activate a sort of obscure constitutional office to deal with this crisis, and that is the office of dictator. Now, dictators are essentially, they're an extra officer with imperium, nominated not by a popular vote usually, but rather by one of the consuls who can say, we're in an emergency, we need a dictator. The dictator has some exceptional powers. For one thing, his imperium is senior to that of the consuls. He is not subject to provocatio. He has 24 lictors rather than 12. So it essentially is in an emergency situation empowering a general with sort of extraordinary powers to command. Now, we obviously, rightfully, after the 20th century, think dictator is a really dirty word, a term for essentially an autocrat or a monarch, in all but name. For the Romans, a dictator is an emergency office, and there is a safeguard on the powers that dictator is given. The safeguard is they only last for 6 months. And oftentimes they're even task-based. So we hear of dictators. Dictators have been most commonly used in the 4th century. During, if either you need an extra magistrate to deal with a military crisis, or during the time of those strange consular tribunes. A dictator may be someone who's appointed when the board of tribunes is inadequate. But a dictator had not been used recently often. I actually would note, while we talk of dictators as sort of these emergency generals, and that is how the dictator is used in 217, the most common task that a dictator is given is holding an election. And so indeed the dictator, if both consuls are away, if they're off fighting and the election rolls around, a consul needs to be there to hold the election. That's one thing that a praetor can't do. So one consul will nominate a dictator that gives him the imperium to hold the election, and then he holds the election and steps down. So as we go into the most trying moment of 2020, the only, I can only offer the odd historical fact that the Romans appoint dictators to oversee their elections, and this is a successful thing for them. Suffice it to say, this time, the dictator that they appoint, a patrician named Fabius Maximus, is a dictator to deal with a military emergency. And his strategy at this point is Hannibal has destroyed the Roman armies that have confronted him. Fabius basically realizes that Hannibal is a superior general and has a well-disciplined, experienced army that he doesn't think that the next batch of hastily levied Roman soldiers can deal with. So therefore, Fabius decides for a strategy of delay. That is, he's not going to try to confront Hannibal. He's simply going to try and mirror Hannibal, prevent Hannibal from doing damage. But he's not going to actually try to engage him in a set-piece battle as the consuls Scipio and Gracchus had done. So this is his delay strategy. This doesn't play well with the Romans. The Romans really have a martial culture that even the common citizens and common soldiers themselves demand engagement, confrontation, battle. And don't like the idea of, we're just kind of following Hannibal around Italy, but we're never trying to fight him. What's the point of that? And indeed, Fabius faces a challenge that the Romans, in another kind of unprecedented constitutional move, elect a second dictator, a critic of Fabius, although this second dictator subsequently loses a minor engagement to Hannibal and sort of has to admit that maybe Fabius was right. So Fabius and his strategy of delay for the rest of 217, again, it doesn't get Hannibal out of Italy. It does push him into southern Italy, towards Apulia, but at least prevents any more damage from being done. In 216, the Romans, however, seem to recommit to engagement. They raise an extraordinarily large army, probably 8 legions, and these 8 legions are brought to a strength of over 5,000 infantry, and with equal wings of allies, that's probably about 80,000 men. Both consuls, Terentius Varro and Aemilius Paullus, are sent to confront Hannibal, and here there should be no question. They are being sent to bring Hannibal to battle and destroy him. that seems to be the obvious strategy here. They're not doing a strategy of delay. So these two armies do confront Hannibal in Apulia at Cannae. And here, Hannibal, who is quite outnumbered, at this point he only has about 50,000 men. One problem, and you can say maybe one successful thing about Fabius Maximus's strategy of delay is it has moved Hannibal away from his most reliable source of new recruits. He still has a lot of Gauls in his army, but new Gallic warriors are hard to come by when you're all the way down in southern Italy. Eventually, he will rely on Italian peoples who will defect to Rome. But at this point, most Italian peoples have stayed loyal. And despite Hannibal trying to peel them off, and so Hannibal will do things when he takes prisoners. He will send the Italians back home and say, tell everybody what a nice guy I am, and then he will treat the Roman citizen prisoners with great cruelty and eventually sell them into slavery. So Hannibal is trying to peel off Rome's Italian allies, but he hasn't succeeded yet. Probably because many Italian allies are still banking that the Romans are going to be able to finally crush him after a few years of frustration. So Hannibal, outnumbered, therefore sets his most magnificent trap yet. And indeed, Cannae is generally held to be the most successful tactical masterpiece in ancient military history, and perhaps even in all of military history, in which Hannibal, with the smaller army, will manage to effect a double envelopment of the Roman army. And so Hannibal's plan here is, again, to anticipate the aggression of the Romans. Now, when two Roman consuls operate side by side, they can either, in theory, one can say, okay, I'm just going to give the other, knowledge, let him run the show. Usually they don't do that because they've got egos. So what they do is they alternate commands. So Aemilius Paullus commands one day and Terentius Varro commands another day. The battle takes place on the day that Varro is in command. And because Aemilius Paullus is a patrician and from a splendid family, and his descendants will be oral sources for Publius, this kind of creates, there will be this idea that, well, Paullus didn't want to fight this battle, this foolish battle, but Varro was too aggressive and it was his fault. I mean, no, clearly both men were ready to bring Hannibal to battle. And I don't know if it had been Paulus's day, if he would have done any better. He dies in the battle. So Hannibal is relying that the Romans are going to be really aggressive. And so what he does is he puts out, he raises forces to probably match the Roman line. He makes them very, very thin in the middle. And in the middle, he puts the troops that he finds the least reliable. The Celtic warriors who speak a different language, who may have their own kind of agenda, and some of his Iberians. He puts those in the middle in a kind of convex line, a thin line. And then on the wings, in a kind of column, he has his best soldiers, his most reliable soldiers, the soldiers he can also communicate with, his Africans. And then he also has his cavalry on the side. And the plan of the battle is, as the Romans attack, he expects that they will push back the Gauls and the Iberians. He wants them to fall back. Because what he wants to do is the Romans, as they attack, are driving back the Gauls, they're driving back the Iberians and Hannibal's army. They're feeling very successful, and therefore they charge forward. They plunge forward. They do exactly what Hannibal expects. And as they attack, and of course this is common with military units, as they move forward and make contact with the enemy, they start to lose their cohesion. They eventually a military unit that is in contact with the enemy long enough will start to more resemble a mob than a coherent, tactically organized unit. So the Romans, as they push back the Iberians and the Gauls, slowly start to devolve from organized units into mobs. Now, couple of, you could say, problems the Romans have. One, their soldiers are still quite green. New levy in 216, a lot of these soldiers have never fought a battle before. Secondly, perhaps not trusting their soldiers. The Roman commanders have arrayed their troops particularly deep. Again, it's quite likely that instead of having the sentries in each manable fight side by side, they're stacking them on top of one another. Suffice it to say, Publius says that the maniples are much deeper than they are wide, which is unusual. And they may be doing that simply because that's one way you deal with green troops in kind of this type of battle, is you say, we're just going to make the units that much deeper to kind of provide a bulwark against the troops' unreliability. So the Romans are themselves particularly deep, and therefore they turn into basically this huge disorganized mob that's pushing into Hannibal's center and thinking that it's winning as the Celts and the Iberians are pushed back. Too late for them, because Hannibal springs his Africans, he has them wheel around and attack the Romans' flank, and now he has this huge mob of disorganized Roman soldiers kind of 3/4 of the way surrounded. The Romans are doomed when the Carthaginian cavalry on either side manages to chase away the Roman cavalry and then swings around and attacks the Roman in the rear for a full envelopment. Now, a number of Romans do manage to escape, again, because the Celts and the Iberians, their line is so thin. Over 10,000 or so managed to bust through the center and escape. Included in those survivors are that young Scipio, the young cavalryman who had saved his father, the consul, in 218. He's now a military tribute. He now escapes, and supposedly the soldiers elect him to be their leader. So again, a key figure to watch for. He's at this debacle as one of the survivors. So there are probably around 15,000 or so Roman soldiers who survived. The rest, though, are surrounded and are brutally massacred. Upwards of 45,000 Roman soldiers are killed that day, perhaps more. And this is a crushing Roman victory. This battle has left a long kind of shadow on military history. The ability of to have a force engage in this kind of almost perfect double envelopment has been sort of an inspiration to other military leaders and thinkers. So the von Schlieffen, the German general who produced the von Schlieffen plan, which saw big pincers of the German army eventually try to move into, strike through Belgium and attack France. The idea of sending those big pincer columns was his, he was inspired by Cannae. He actually wrote a book on the Battle of Cannae, even though he was trying to do with, railroads and marching columns what Hannibal had done with simply his Africans maneuvering. Supposedly also Norman Schwarzkopf during the First Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War, said that he was inspired by thinking about the Battle of Cannae for his decision to send a long column, the 18th Airborne Corps, to try and to envelop a significant portion of the Iraqi army. So this kind of tactical masterpiece is one that again has been studied will be studied and emulated with various degrees of success by many commanders to come. For now, it is a disaster for the Romans. Aemilius Paullus, one consul, is killed. Terentius Varro rides back to Rome to announce the disaster. He survives. And here he is, the Senate thanks him for not despairing the Republic. And while he doesn't hold another consulship, he will continue to hold some moderately important commands for the rest of the war, which suggests that the Senate doesn't necessarily think this whole disaster was his fault. Now, one group of people the Senate does blame are the common soldiers who survived, those soldiers who had managed to bust out and eventually also stream back to Rome. They are basically blamed for losing the battle, and they are dispatched to Sicily, where their punishment is they will have to serve continuously in Sicily abroad until the war comes to its conclusion. That punishment incidentally does not apply to the military tribunes like our young Publius Cornelius Scipio. Now that being said, the Romans are in a terrible place, and they are forced to take truly emergency measures. They are out of manpower because they've suffered such extraordinary casualties. They've probably lost between 100 to 120,000 killed in action, let alone captured and wounded or simply deserted. And they also are out of, probably increasingly running out of money to pay the soldiers. Also, Up till now, the Italians have been loyal. After the Battle of Cannae, that collapses. A number of wavering Italian peoples, particularly those in southern Italy, where the destruction of these Roman armies has left them vulnerable to Hannibal, they peel away. And the big losses are the Samnites, not all of the Samnites, but a number of the Samnite tribes, the Lucanians, outside of the Italian. There's some Etruscans are seriously wavering, but they are ultimately kept loyal with the infusion of Roman forces into that region. Also, there are international implications beyond Italy. In Syracuse, which had been a Roman ally since 263, when Hero II had been defeated and then had agreed to give the Romans supplies in the First Punic War. Syracuse has been a Roman ally, but now Syracuse sides with Carthage, basically seeing the writing on the wall. Also, Macedonia in 215. The king of Macedonia, young Philip V, tries to, or basically signs a treaty with Hannibal, a treaty of friendship and cooperation. And that treaty is actually intercepted by the Romans, who are so angry they will eventually declare war on Macedonia. So we have the defections of Italian allies, we have other Italian allies wavering, we have the Romans having suffered extraordinary casualties that ultimately leave them, even with their huge pool of manpower, short of the ability to replenish their forces. And so what we will look at next time is how the Romans recover and then how they eventually win this terrible war. So that will probably go into next week. We're a little off the syllabus. That's all right. So I'll see you next time for that.